Howdy folks, welcome back to Boondockery. Today I'm going to be talking about cold weather and canister fuel stoves. Camping in cold weather presents all kinds of challenges that we have to consider and overcome if we want to enjoy ourselves on our winter camping trips. One of those considerations is our choice of camp stoves that we're going to be using in the cold weather. In my humble opinion, I believe the best stove choice would be a twig stove or a small wood stove. Although a twig stove does have a few shortcomings, and there are some issues that can present itself along the way, but with practice and experience, you're going to be able to find good, usable, dry firewood and to process it in a way to where you can use it in just about any environment, including cold weather. The best thing that I have found about packing a wood stove or a twig stove is the fact that that's the only thing you have to worry about. That one item, that's it. You don't have to pack along the fuel, because in winter camping, I have found anyway, that winter gear is bulky. And if you don't have the income to buy all the ultralight down stuff and things like that, it can be heavy too. So the nice thing about the wood stove, all you got to do is take the stove and find your fuel once you get to your camp. And having fewer items in your pack, taking up space and adding weight, it's only going to make your trek out to where you're going even a little bit more enjoyable. There are multitudes of really good quality stove systems out there that work absolutely fantastic in ideal conditions. However, even the most expensive, the most well thought out, and the most well engineered stove system has particular challenges when it comes to dealing with extreme cold weather. My number 2 pick, second to the twig stove, would have to be a liquid fuel stove like the MSR Whisperlite International, those types of stove systems, because the liquid fuel has an incredibly low freezing temperature. You have to be like 50 below zero before it starts to gel a little bit, but with the right system, you get the right amount of pressure in there. It'll even pump that gel out, and if you have a good quality stove, it's going to ignite and it's going to burn. All non-twig stoves are going to require your stove, aka burner. You're going to need to have a fuel and also a container to carry that fuel in. And of course, weight and bulk vary dramatically depending on what stove system you're choosing. Now, one of the more widely available and definitely probably one of the most common and most purchased types of stoves are the small fuel canister stoves. They range dramatically in their design, their size, their weight, and their operations. For the most part, these stoves are very convenient, they're very easy to use, and some of them can be dirt cheap. However, using these types of stoves in extreme cold weather definitely affects the fuel efficiency and the stove efficiency. I'm going to share with you a couple ways to where you can improve that fuel efficiency and the stove efficiency. First, I'm going to talk about the canister fuels in general. That way you have a working knowledge of canister fuels, so that when we get to the hacks I'm going to show you, those hacks will make a lot more sense. If you're the impatient type, you probably aren't interested in learning about the fuels, the safety hazards, or any of the other issues surrounding canister fuels. So you might want to go ahead and fast forward to the point to where you see me actually working with canister stoves. That way you'll be able to get the hacks, you'll be able to get the information that you want, but everyone else, you can enjoy all the information that I have prepared for you. The type of canister fuel I'm going to be focusing on is just your basic run-of-the-mill, find them anywhere, screw-on type of canister. It is by far the most common available, and it utilizes the resealable Lindahl valve. Virtually every single one of these types of canister fuels come in almost an identical style of container and contain a blend of either isobutane and propane or butane and propane. Most manufacturers produce a 100 gram canister, a 220 gram canister, which this happens to be, and a 500 gram canister. There are numerous adapters that you can get for this Lindahl valve that will enable you to use other types of stoves that utilize other types of fuel canisters or different types of fuels to be able to utilize the mixes that are available in these canister fuels. The canisters are filled with a blend of fuel that exists in two states, either liquid or gas. Unlike other types of fuels like alcohol, gasoline, white gas, kerosene, things like that, at room temperature, those fuels can exist in two states at the same time. They can be liquid and vapor. The fuel blends that are in these canisters, if they were exposed to room temperature, they could only exist in one state, which is gas. Each of the three fuels that are used to create the fuels that go in these canisters will exist in a liquid state until a certain temperature. Then it will gasify. Each one of these three fuels will change that state at different temperatures. The temperature that this change occurs is often referred to as the boiling point. Butane's boiling point is negative 0.5 degrees Celsius or 31 degrees Fahrenheit. Isobutane's boiling point is negative 12 Celsius or negative 11 degrees Fahrenheit. Propane's boiling point is at negative 42 degrees Celsius or negative 44 degrees Fahrenheit. The blends that the manufacturers use to create their gases for these vary from company to company. But the reason that they use the blend is that propane burns much cleaner and butane or isobutane burns much hotter. When we're talking about these canister fuels, we have to understand the fact that the fuel, when it's in that container, exists in its own little micro atmosphere. The temperature inside the canister is by far much colder than the outside temperature around it. As a matter of fact, you might have noticed when you pick one of these little canisters up, how cool they feel. This cooling is created by the evaporative constant which exists inside the canister. When you actually hook a stove up to this and you begin to use it, it's actually creating a colder temperature than when it's completely sealed due to that evaporative nature. The evaporation is creating extreme cold as the fuel leaves the canister. As a matter of fact, I have noticed a couple times when I've used one of these canister stoves in a prolonged period of time and temperatures above freezing but below 40 degrees that ice can actually accumulate on the outside of the canister and the stove if the humidity outside is pretty high. In extremely cold temperatures, the propane can actually separate from the butane or isobutane because it has a much lower boiling rate temperature and will actually burn out prior to the butane. Then what happens in those extreme low temperatures is that the butane cannot gasify, therefore cannot burn. Several companies actually create a special cold weather blend, and some have just gone the distance and build the cold weather blends as a 4-season blend. It's very important to remember when we're talking about all this that regardless of what the exterior temperature is, the temperature inside the canister is far lower than the outside temperature around it. Now, if you've used these canister stoves in very cold temperatures, you'll notice if it gets really cold that the fuel pressure, the gas pressure in these things actually start to reduce. Sometimes it gets so cold that your stove will actually begin to sputter and spurt and have very ineffective burn rates. As temperatures start falling well below zero, you're going to notice that that pressure rate is also going to drop dramatically as the temperature falls. And of course, all of this is also dependent upon the elevation in which you're using the canister stove. In cold temperatures, the amount of fuel you have in your stove is also going to affect the amount of pressure that you're going to get from the gas flow from these canisters. Even in low temperatures, these canisters perform okay as long as they're at least half full. You notice how positive I am? I said half full. I'm awesome. Once the fuel level drops to below half, you're going to start noticing a dip in performance from the fuel pressure coming from the canister. There are a lot of different ways you can determine how much fuel is left in your canister. Now, one of which is, of course, if you bought it brand new, you can assume that it's full, or at least going to be able to be full enough for you to be able to use it for the duration of time that you're out. However, you can also use kitchen scales, and there's all kinds of information online where you can determine the weight of your fuel canister to see exactly how much fuel is left, and also formulas on burn rates, burn times, things like that, so you can see how many burns you have left with the fuel you have. I'm going to show you a way to where you can check the fuel level of your fuel canisters while you're in the field. The snowing slowed down enough to where I could bring the camera out from underneath the tarp and to be able to show you this. Now, all you need to be able to check your fuel level for your fuel canisters is a decent sized container that your fuel canister can actually fit inside, and some water. First thing we're going to do, we're going to put enough water inside the container to where it's at least the, ooh, that is quite icy. I'm going to have to open that up and pour it out the old-fashioned way. Hopefully we'll have enough liquid water to be able to do the trick here. What you want to do, you want to get the water level inside your container to be at least the same height as the canister. It doesn't have to be a whole lot larger in diameter than the stove, but it needs to be able to float freely. And I have just the right amount of water that is liquid. You're going to put your fuel canister in here, and when you do, you want to make sure you burp the air bubble out and be able to float it. There's going to be a little bit of air in there, so that's just a little bit. By looking at that float, it's approximately halfway up the side. Now, companies like MSR, our elevation's about right here. MSR actually has icons on the exterior of their fuel canisters, so when you do this in the field, you know exactly where it is. But approximately right through here, if you're floating to this point, you've got about 1/4 of your fuel. Up here where mine is, I'm just a little under half. So right now, at half, at this particular temperature, my particular fuel pressure is going to start to suffer. So by this point, you're probably wondering, well, why in the world would you even use a canister stove in the winter? Well, there are all kinds of reasons. One of which is that a lot of the stoves are very inexpensive and they're very compact. When you're dealing with winter camping, I mean, you've got a lot of bulky items that just take up a lot of room in the pack. And some of these stoves are tiny. It's like the little BRS stove is like this big when it's folded up, and it's practically no weight. Another thing is for convenience. They're easy, and they're readily available. The fuel canisters are readily available all over the place. I can actually purchase them inside my little village instead of having to drive a half an hour to get to the closest store outside of my village. But really it boils down to you use what you've got. You know, there's a lot of folks out here that they start off using a canister stove and they just have it. And when you look at some of the other fuel systems out there for stoves, if you're using a liquid stoves, things like that, I remember my Whisper Like International was the bomb at the time when I bought it like 10 years ago, and it was about $125 then. It's a lot more expensive now. Now the biggest challenge is how to keep your canisters warm enough to be able to produce enough gaseous qualities to the fuel in order to maintain good fuel pressure and also to have a good burn rate. And the big question, well, how in the world do I do that in sub-freezing temperatures? The easy answer is to change the temperature of the canister. Now right now, a lot of you have little red flags going up, little whoopee lights going off, sirens going off. It's like, well, wait a minute. How can you do that safely? And the answer is yes. But before we get into all that, let's take a look at the warning labels on the canister. I wrote down a few of the warnings that were on the canister of the Coleman fuel I've been using, and it clearly states, do not, and I repeat, do not expose to heat or store at temperatures above 120 degrees Fahrenheit or 49 degrees Celsius. However, it also states that you are not to puncture it. Do not smoke around it, as in cigarettes. Do not refill. Do not expose to flames or sparks or electric motors. Do not expose it to sunlight for prolonged periods of time. And in California, exposure to fumes may cause cancer, birth defects, and may cause reproductive harm. Now, after using canister stoves for a very long period of time and talking with other people that have, they make, and I don't mean they, manufacturers produce tools to specifically puncture your fuel canister in order to make it safe for disposal. I've actually seen people pick up their small little BRS stove when it's burning to light a cigar. I've seen it. And there's all kinds of companies out there that make all kinds of attachments so you can refill your canisters. And you know, the puncturing tool and the refill tools are widely available and quite popular, by the way. And if you can't expose your canister to flames or sparks, how in the world are you supposed to use it? Seriously. I mean, duh. Now, I've been camping in areas to where there's quite literally virtually no trees. And so what are you supposed to do then? If it's exposed to sunlight for any period of time, do you need to just run away screaming, "Look out! Fire in the hole! Fire in the hole!" No. As a matter of fact, you know, when I was in Colorado one summer, backpacking the Cheyenne Mountain Range, we all, you know, went to REI to be able to pick up a few items that we were going to be using on our trip. We left a lot of those things in our vehicle while we went to other places. Some of those items were canisters, fuel canisters. Now, it got so hot inside the truck that it destroyed my point and shoot camera that was in a shoulder bag I had that was in the floorboards. Okay, it was that hot. Didn't affect the fuel canisters one iota. I didn't measure the temperature, but I know in places like that, in, you know, sun exposure, temperatures inside of a vehicle can easily reach up to 180 degrees. So the whole idea of being exposed to temperatures above 120, I think that's pushing it. Now, due to federal and state regulations, guidelines, manufacturers are required to put certain warnings and labels on their products. And in the real world of litigation, they have to cover their hind ends as well. So a lot of times when they put these safety concerns on here and these warnings, you know, they could be right on the money, but for the most part, they exaggerate those in order to cover their hind ends completely. So therefore, if anyone does not do what they're supposed to, or worse yet, they do what they're not supposed to do according to the label, the company is covered legally. All that being said, let this be my disclaimer. Do not do anything that I'm going to show you. Therefore, if you do, I'm free of litigation. Now, all that stuff being said, there are very real threats concerning burns, explosions, and death. But almost every time any of these things have actually really happened, and believe it or not, they actually have really happened, it's due to gross negligence and, you know, in my very blunt, humble opinion, stupidity was the culminating factor that led to any of the mishaps. One of which that I read about was an individual. They were winter camping and they weren't getting very efficient burn rates with their canister. So they set it close to the fire, like on the fire ring around the fire. And they went out and did whatever they were going to do, completely forgot about it. The heat and the temperature reached well over 200 degrees, I'm certain of it, and the internal pressure went up. It blew up and boom, there it went, big fireball, everything. The other one that I read about was a group of campers that were using their canister stove one morning, and they had a decent sized pot, like my billy pot, and they had that on the stove. Well, they were dealing with some winds, so they completely wrapped the windscreen around the kettle. And so basically what they did is they created an oven underneath the pot. It was completely enclosed from the bottom of the pot down to the ground. And what happened is that area below the stove began to heat up tremendously. And when they're trying to boil a lot of water that they were trying to boil for multiple meals, that meant it was burning for a long period of time. That heat was being trapped by the titanium screen, the ground, and the bottom of the pot. As a result, it exploded. There were severe burns because when these things blow up, depending on how much fuel's in them, they create a huge ball of flames. So there were extreme burns. There was damage to materials around tarps, backpacks, things like that. There were injuries that was created from shrapnel from the canister and the windscreen in the pot that blew up when all this happened. So if by any chance you are using a windscreen with a canister stove and a cook pot, make certain that you are allowing a good amount of space around that so that you're stopping the wind but not trapping the heat. Other alternatives, stack up some rocks between the stove and the wind. Put it behind a log. Make a wooden windbreak on one side. All kinds of different things you can do to prevent heat buildup on those canisters when you're using your canister stove. Of the hacks I'm going to show you, depending upon the severity of the cold, certain types of canister stoves might not work real well. This is one for an example. This is my Trangia stove for my Trangia 27 cook set. Now if you notice, there's a long hose here. Now when you have this long hose, you have a tendency for that to fall down in the snow. It has a long exposure to wind and things like that. So if you have gas coming out of your stove, it may actually cool as it's coming through. So if you have just like an extension to a regular burner, like you have with the BRS, or that you have with a pocket rocket, something like that, which is literally just a burner at the end of a hose, you're going to have some issues with that because it's going to liquefy. The pressure is going to push it out. Even if you have a warm temperature with your canister, it gasifies okay, it may turn back into liquid here. However, the Trangia has what's called a generator. And what the generator does is it actually heats up. So I'll talk about here in a second. It heats this tube up, which will gasify the liquefied butane and propane that come through this and regasify it so that it will burn. Now, when you first use this, what you will have a problem with is you may not be able to get it lit properly because gas goes in the attachment here in the valve, goes through the hose, turns back into liquid, and you're trying to light a gas out of this, and what's coming out is liquid. It may be an issue with you being able to light it. One of the things that I have done is I will simply take a Vaseline cotton ball, one of my homemade fire starters, tear off a section of that, put it underneath the generator, and actually light it and let it burn until it's almost burned out. Then when I turn on my valve and the gas turns into liquid going through the hose, it will then be heated by the generator in order to gasify it, and that little bit of a burn that's just still going on with my homemade fire starters are going to ignite the flame. So just a little note, a little thing to think about before I show you the next hack. The first method I'm going to show you is called the water method. One of the ways that you can warm up the temperature of the fuel to get a better pressure and also to get a better fuel blend burn is to increase that temperature by utilizing water. Now remember, the highest boiling rate is for butane, which is 31 degrees Fahrenheit. If water is liquid, then that would make that temperature higher than 32 degrees. So it is going to warm it up to some degree. So you just put your fuel canister in there, add a little bit of water, not enough for it to float, of course, and your burn rate should be a little bit better and your pressure should be a little bit better. Now, it's not going to be dramatic, but it will definitely make it to where it will actually function, whereas in extremely low temperatures that are below that freezing or that boiling point is going to affect it negatively. The next method I'm going to show you is the hot hands method. Now, hot hands are made of a mixture of iron powder, activated charcoal, and sodium chloride, and it's all put into a microporous pouch. Now, in order for this to actually do anything, let alone heat up, is you first remove it from the plastic paper or the plastic wrapper that it comes in. And once you've taken it out, you shake it up. And by doing so, you're drawing oxygen into this microporous pouch, and you are activating a chemical process, which is basically glorified rusting. The sodium chloride that's in here is going to start activating with the iron powder that's in here, and that chemical process is creating heat. And the activated charcoal helps draw more oxygen in as it is very hygroscopic. And as that heats up, little pores expand in there and actually creating little insulators. So the activated charcoal is actually helping to insulate this in a way to where you can actually hold on to it. It's still good and warm, still good and hot, but without that activated charcoal in there, it would be too hot to handle. Now, on the package, it states that one of these little hand warmers can reach temperatures of 126 degrees Fahrenheit through 144 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 52 degrees Celsius through 62 degrees Celsius. Now, one thing I found out, which I think is pretty cool with these little boogers, they're quite handy. But do you know that you can actually pause the heating process of these hot hands and actually make them last longer? Yeah, the only reason that this reaction is occurring is due to oxygen. If you deprive this hand warmer of oxygen by putting it in an airtight container, it can be as simple as a Ziploc bag. All of a sudden, that chemical reaction process stops. Let's say you're out doing something, your hands are cold, you activate one of your hand warmers, then you go inside, you do something for a little while. You put your hand warmer in your Ziploc bag while you're doing that. And when you're finished doing it, you got to go back out in the cold again. You just open it right up, shake it, and within 15 minutes, it is reactivated and will go back to the temperature it was before you put it in the airtight container. Now let me show you how this little beauty works. This is a hot hand. Very easily, you could, on the ground, dry ground, put a hot hand, put your stove right over top of it, and that's going to accelerate that to the point that it's going to improve gas flow. Now again, you're not supposed to heat these things above 120 degrees. We know that the hand warmers themselves can get to 126 through 144 degrees Fahrenheit. Remember when I told you that the temperature inside the canister is far colder than the exterior temperature? So I don't know exactly how you're supposed to measure the temperature. If I were to use one of the laser thermometers to shoot this with, to get the temperature of it being over 120 degrees, it says do not expose to temperatures above 120 degrees. That's the total atmosphere, okay, around it. But we also know that that's exaggerated. So again, don't do this. Don't you dare do this. Now, shake this up. Let it warm up for about 15 minutes. And you can just set it on the ground, put that on top of it, let it wait about 10 minutes. I guarantee you that the gasification is going to be better than it was before when it was cold. And I cannot guarantee this. I can't. Don't do this. Don't do this. It will elevate the temperature just enough to improve the gasification and the pressure and the flow of gas through your stove. But, you know, I can't just set something on the ground. I got to do something special. So I have made a two-part cozy for my canister. I'll show you how to do that in just a minute. Two-part. This is an inner lining here, extra insulation on the bottom because we're putting it in the snow or on frozen ground, because we're only going to do this when it's extremely cold out and it is negatively affecting our canister, our fuel canister. So put this inside here and there we go. Wait a few minutes or not. I believe from my experiences that I believe it begins to work better almost immediately. If you want to let it sit there for a few, not a problem. The other thing is, remember when I told you that the hot hands can be paused? Because when they're is an airtight environment, they stop working at all. But that little bit of activated charcoal is an insulator, and it retains some of that heat, so that heat can be felt for several minutes afterwards. You can try an experiment at home. Take your hot hand, activate it, put it in a Ziploc bag, let it set for 10-15 minutes, pick it up. You're still going to feel some warmth. Pick it up an hour later, you're not going to feel any warmth. It's completely done. I've built this thing, well, pretty good. And as a result, when I have this stored in here, and I will pack this like this because it makes a lot less noise. And if you're used to carrying your canister inside of a kettle or cook pot, it fits perfect. You might want to think about that. But if you have a little bit of room to spare, it bangs around a little bit, something like this will definitely come in handy. Even if all you're going to do is use it as a canister silencer inside your cook pot, it's a good idea to make one. Now, when I remove this, look, that bottom portion that I inserted in here is now locked inside the bottom rim of the canister. And when this is inside there, it's blocking off a tremendous amount of oxygen. I wouldn't say all the oxygen, but I would say it's definitely going to stop enough oxygen entry into that hot hand to prevent it from continuing to heat. It's going to go dormant. It's going to do it slowly. It's going to produce heat at a lower rate. But it's still going to positively affect the performance of the canister, the fuel, and your stove. Let's see how I made this. This is what you're going to need. You're going to need a Sharpie, you're going to need some Reflectix, a pair of scissors, and a pair of insulated aluminum tape. Well, folks, Murphy's Law is alive and well. When I was recording at my campsite, demonstrating on how to make the koozie, I must have inadvertently pushed my remote button to record. So when I sat down to actually record, when I pushed the remote, it stopped recording. And every time that I stopped it to change scenes, it was recording everything I didn't want. So what I'm going to do, I'm here in my studio and I'm going to go ahead and reshoot that particular portion of the video so you can see how to make that koozie. Once again, all you're going to need is some Reflectix, some insulated aluminum tape, a pair of scissors, a Sharpie, and your canister. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to trim off this little bit of scrap here. I'm just reusing a piece of scrap that has been left over from other projects. So that way I have a nice flat, even edge. It's pretty flat, fairly even. It doesn't have to be absolutely exact. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use my canister and roll it around until it makes contact with the other piece of Reflectix. And once that does that, I'm going to make a little mark there so I know where to cut it. Yeah, that's pretty good right there. So I have my mark here. So I'm going to go ahead and trim that off right on that mark. And the nice thing about Reflectix is that everything is lined up to where you have little guidelines in between the little bubbles there. That just happens to be lined up perfectly there. Pull that around. Perfect fit. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go around the inside of the Reflectix, and I'm just going to mark all the way around the top portion of the canister. Just right around the top area here. So now I have that line, and I'm going to use the little bubbles as guideline, so that way I have a good even line going all the way across. And that's what we're looking for. Just enough to cover the sides, not the top. And it connects perfectly right here. Next step, we're going to go over, take a small section. Got to think economy of materials here. So I don't want to waste any particular amount of material because I can always reuse that. And I'm going to trace the bottom of the canister. I'm going to cut that out and then bring it back. Now I have my long rectangle for the side. I have a small circle, which is actually going to nestle inside the bottom of the canister. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to use my reflective insulated aluminum tape to tape through here. I'm just going to use my rectangle of Reflectix as a measuring device and make a little line right here. Put this over here so you can see it. Right there, and it's just going to be enough to hold that together. And I'm going to trim that off. I'm going to peel back the paper here so it's going to expose the adhesive side of the aluminum. I'm just going to peel that back just a little bit because you peel it all the way off, it just has a tendency to want to roll. What I'm going to do is I'm going to roll this around and I'm going to tape the inside first. Let me see how well you can see this. It's a lot easier when you're not doing this for the camera. Pull that around. Put that right up there at the top. And as you're pulling back the paper, you're just sticking the aluminum tape to the inside there. We're going to do that again, except this time we're going to make it overlap. So we're going to go ahead and make it a little bit longer on both sides. Trim that off. And for this, I'm going to go ahead and slide it over the canister. Peel that paper off. And we're going to start probably about an inch, inch and a half into that, depending on how much you overlapped. And we're just going to pull that down and through. Remove the canister. And then we will fold this in over the top and also at the bottom. Now we have the side completely finished. And next step, we're going to make another circle utilizing the canister and the walls. Again, trying to think of conservation materials. I'm taking this odd end over here. I'm going to place the canister with the side walls on there. Line it up. And I'm going to trace that with my Sharpie. And this is going to be a larger diameter. This is going to be the actual base of the koozie. And now I'm going to cut that out. Now I have my inner insulator, which is the smaller diameter circle. I have the larger diameter circle, which is going to be the actual base. Now I'm going to use the aluminum tape and I'm going to wrap that around the wall, and I'm going to overlap that probably by about 1 inch or 2, and I'm going to cut that off. I'm going to turn this over to the side, push this into where the lip of the bottom is not protruding beyond the walls, and I'm going to begin to wrap the base with the tape. And again, you just want to peel a little bit of this off to get that to expose just a small portion of it. And again, this is easier when you're not recording, and you're just going to line it up and roll that around and checking occasionally, make sure that you're on line. It's definitely easier to do this in the studio than it was outside, because it was quite cold. It was about 20 degrees when I was doing my filming outside. And you roll that around, and you're more concerned about the contact with the bottom of the side walls. Now, as you can see, there's some overhang here, and what we're going to do with that overhang is we're going to snip in 1 inch intervals all the way around. Until you come back full circle. Now what you're going to do is you're going to pull these out just a little bit, open those up so we can put our base in. One thing you can do if you want to ensure that the base is going to stay in place, put your smaller circle insulator, just stuff it down inside the bottom of the canister, and then rest your base on top there. And then what you're going to do is you're going to start folding every other segment of tape over until you get full circle, and then you start folding over the remainder of the tape. Now, smoothing this out toward the inside, and also again on the exterior, you have a completed canister fuel koozie. Now remember, don't do any of this. Don't do any of this. Now, if you wanted to, if you don't like the noise that this produces, which is minimal, you can always use some camouflage tape to wrap around it. That'll help silence it, and it will also, make it camouflage. But you also have the top of this. Now, the one thing you can do, you very easily can make another wrap of Reflectix that will slide over top of this and have a base that has a hole cut in it, so it's completely insulated. I think that's a little overkill on this. The method that I've tried works very, very well for me. So, that's how you make the koozie. Once you have all that done, remove your fuel canister. Might stick a little bit with the tape. just a little bit. And then insert your smaller diameter circle of Reflectix, and you're ready to put it to use. But remember, do not do this. Well, folks, hopefully through this long video you have a better understanding as far as what fuel canisters are when you're using fuel canister stoves. You understand what they're made of, what the pros and the cons of using fuel canisters are, and cold weather, how cold weather affects them, and how you can do certain things in order to increase their efficiency. Now remember, don't do anything I showed you. Don't do it. I mean it. Well, anyway, folks, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time.